The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the judge, a stern figure in a black robe, as she prepared to deliver her ruling in a custody battle that had dragged on for months. The tension was palpable, the kind that makes your stomach twist into knots. On one side of the room sat a woman, her face etched with worry, clutching a tissue so tightly it was nearly shredded. On the other side, a man sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously between the judge and his ex-wife. This wasn't just any custody case. It was a fight over their 10-year-old son, a boy caught in the middle of a storm he never asked for. But what no one expected was that this boy, this quiet, unassuming child, was about to change everything. The judge had just begun to speak, her voice steady and authoritative, when the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. All heads turned as a small figure stepped inside. It was the boy. His name was Ethan. He looked nervous, his hands trembling, but there was something in his eyes, a determination that didn't belong to a child his age. The bailiff moved to stop him, but the judge raised her hand, silencing the room with a single gesture. "Let him speak," she said, her voice softer now, almost curious. Ethan walked slowly to the front, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. He stopped in front of the judge's bench, took a deep breath, and then he began to talk. What came out of his mouth next left everyone in the room stunned, especially the judge. Ethan's words were simple, but they carried a weight that no one could ignore. He spoke about the nights he spent lying awake, listening to his parents argue. He talked about the promises they had both made to him, promises that were broken over and over again. He described the pain of feeling like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, torn between two people he loved but who couldn't seem to love each other anymore. And then, he said something that made the entire courtroom gasp. "I don't want to live with either of you," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "I want to live with my grandma." The room erupted in murmurs, but Ethan wasn't finished. He turned to the judge and said, "I know you're supposed to decide, but I just want someone to listen to me for once." The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. She looked at Ethan, then at his parents, who were both staring at their son in shock. The tension in the room was electric, like a storm about to break. The judge cleared her throat, and everyone fell, silent again. "Ethan," she said slowly, "you've given us a lot to think about." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied the boy. "But before I make my decision, I need to ask you one more question." Ethan nodded, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. The judge leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Why your grandma?" she asked. "Why not your parents?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes filling with tears. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, his father stood up, his face red with anger. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he shouted. "He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying." The judge slammed her gavel down, silencing him instantly. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson," she said sharply. "This is not your time to speak." She turned back to Ethan, her expression softening. "Go on, Ethan," she said gently. "Tell us why." Ethan took another deep breath, his small chest rising and falling as he gathered his thoughts. He looked at his parents, then at the judge, and finally he began to speak. But what he said next was so shocking, so unexpected, that even the judge was left speechless. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And just as he was about to reveal the final piece of the puzzle, the judge raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's enough for now," she said, her voice firm but kind. "We'll take a short recess." She stood up, her robes swirling around her, and left the courtroom, leaving everyone in stunned silence. What had Ethan been about to say? What secret was he hiding that could change the outcome of this custody battle? And how would the judge's decision impact this family forever? The answers to these questions would have to wait, because as the bailiff called for order and the parents began to argue once more, one thing was clear: this was far from over. The tension in the room was thicker than ever, and the stakes had never been higher. What would happen next? No one knew, but one thing was certain. This was a story no one would soon forget. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as the judge exited, her robe swishing behind her. Ethan stood frozen in place, his small frame dwarfed by the towering walls and the weight of the moment. His parents, seated on opposite sides of the room, exchanged heated glances but said nothing. The tension between them was like a live wire, crackling and ready to snap. Ethan's mother, Claire, dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Her makeup smudged from hours of crying. His father, Mark, sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his foot tapping impatiently against the floor. Neither of them looked at Ethan, and that hurt more than anything. He had just poured his heart out in front of everyone, and yet it felt like they still weren't really listening. Ethan shuffled back to the wooden bench where his grandmother, Margaret, sat waiting. She reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and reassuring. Margaret was the kind of woman who radiated calm, even in the stormiest of situations. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes, though tired, were full of love. She had been Ethan's safe harbor for as long as he could remember, the one person who always made him feel seen and heard. "You did good, sweetheart," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, but his stomach was in knots. He had said what he needed to say, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew thicker. The lawyers huddled together, whispering furiously, their faces serious. Claire's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, kept glancing at Ethan with a mix of curiosity and concern. Mark's lawyer, a tall man with a booming voice, looked frustrated, as if he couldn't believe the turn the case had taken. The bailiff stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching the room with a wary eye. And then there were the spectators, family, friends, neighbors, and even a few strangers who had come to see the drama unfold. They all leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear what would happen next. Ethan's mind raced as he sat there, his grandmother's hand still holding his. He thought about the past few months, how everything had started to fall apart. It had been small things at first, his parents arguing over dinner, his mom crying in the kitchen late at night, his dad coming home later and later from work. But then it had gotten worse. The fights became louder, more frequent. There were slammed doors, broken dishes, and words that cut deeper than any knife. Ethan had tried to stay out of it, to hide in his room with his headphones on, but it was impossible to escape the tension that filled the house like a thick fog. One night, after a particularly bad fight, Ethan had overheard his parents talking about divorce. The word had hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he knew it was bad. And then a few weeks later, his parents sat him down and told him they were separating. They tried to explain it in a way that wouldn't scare him, but all Ethan could think about was how his life was about to change forever. He didn't want to choose between his mom and his dad. He didn't want to leave his home, his school, his friends. But most of all, he didn't want to feel like he was being pulled in two different directions, like he was somehow responsible for fixing something he didn't break. That's when Ethan had started spending more time with his grandma. Margaret lived just a few blocks away, and her house had always been a second home to him. But now it became his refuge. She didn't ask him a lot of questions, and she didn't try to make him feel better with empty words. Instead, she just let him be. They would bake cookies together, watch old movies, or sit in silence on her porch watching the world go by. It was during one of those quiet moments that Ethan had first mentioned the idea of living with her. "Would that be okay?" he had asked, his voice small and uncertain. Margaret had looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with sadness and love. "If that's what you want," she had said, "then we'll figure it out together." But figuring it out hadn't been easy. When Ethan's parents found out about his wish, they were furious. They accused each other of turning him against them, of manipulating him into choosing sides. The custody battle, which had already been messy, became even more complicated. Lawyers were called, hearings were scheduled, and Ethan found himself caught in the middle of a fight he didn't want any part of. He just wanted things to go back to the way they were before, but he knew that was impossible. And so, when the judge had asked him to speak in court, he had decided to tell the truth, not the sugar-coated version his parents wanted to hear, but the raw, unfiltered truth about how he felt. Now, as he sat in the courtroom waiting for the judge to return, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. He had been brave, but bravery didn't always lead to happy endings. What if the judge didn't listen to him? What if his parents were so angry that they stopped loving him altogether? The thought made his chest ache, and he squeezed his grandmother's hand a little tighter. "It's going to be okay," Margaret whispered, as if she could read his, but Ethan wasn't so sure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge returned to the courtroom. Everyone stood as she took her seat, her expression unreadable. She looked at Ethan, then at his parents, and finally at the lawyers. "I've heard enough to make a decision," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But before I do, there's one more thing I need to address." She turned to Ethan, her gaze steady. "Ethan, you've shown incredible courage today, but I need to understand something. Why do you feel that living with your grandmother is the best option for you? What is it about your parents' homes that makes you feel unsafe or unhappy?" The room fell silent as everyone waited for Ethan's response. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew this was his chance to explain, to make them understand. But the words felt stuck, like they were caught in a tangled web of fear and uncertainty. He glanced at his parents, hoping to find some kind of reassurance, but their faces were blank, their eyes distant. It was as if they were strangers, not the people who had raised him, who had once been his whole world. Ethan took a deep breath and began to speak. But just as he was about to reveal the truth, the real reason he didn't want to live with either of his parents, the door at the back of the courtroom burst open. Everyone turned to see who had interrupted, and Ethan's heart sank as he recognized the figure standing in the doorway. It was his uncle, his father's younger brother, and he looked frantic. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to know, something that changes everything." The judge raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and irritation. "And what might that be?" she asked, her tone sharp. Ethan's uncle hesitated, his eyes darting around the room before landing on Ethan. "It's about Ethan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it's not something that can wait." The room erupted into chaos as everyone began talking at once. The judge slammed her gavel down, demanding order, but the tension was already at a boiling point. Ethan felt like the walls were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. What was his uncle talking about? What secret was he about to reveal? And how would it change everything? The judge turned to Ethan, her expression softening for just a moment. "We'll take a short recess," she said, her voice firm but kind. "But when we return, I expect answers." She stood up and left the courtroom once more, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Ethan looked at his grandmother, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." As the bailiff called for order and the lawyers began to argue, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The mystery of what his uncle had to say hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the tension in the room was unbearable. What would happen next? No one knew, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. The courtroom was in chaos. Ethan's uncle David stood in the doorway, his face flushed and his breathing heavy as if he had run all the way there. His sudden appearance had thrown everyone into a frenzy. Ethan's parents were on their feet, shouting over each other, their voices a tangled mess of anger and confusion. Claire was demanding to know what was going on while Mark was yelling at his brother to leave. The lawyers were trying to regain control, but even they seemed rattled by the interruption. The judge had left the room, but her absence only made the tension worse. It felt like the entire courtroom was teetering on the edge of something big, something no one was prepared for. Ethan sat frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He looked at his uncle, trying to read his expression, But David's face was unreadable. There was something in his eyes, though, something urgent, almost desperate. Ethan's grandmother, Margaret, tightened her grip on his hand, her face pale but calm. "It's going to be okay," she whispered again. But this time, even she didn't sound convinced. Ethan wanted to believe her, but the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. Whatever his uncle had to say, it wasn't going to be good. Finally, the bailiff managed to restore some order, and the judge returned to the courtroom. She took her seat, her expression stern, and slammed her gavel down once more. "Enough!" she barked, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The room fell silent, but the tension was still thick enough to choke on. The judge turned to David, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her tone sharp, "you have exactly 1 minute to explain why you've interrupted these proceedings. And it had better be good." David stepped forward, his hands trembling as he clutched a manila folder. He glanced at Ethan, then at his brother, and finally at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaky but determined. "I know, this is highly irregular, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. There's something you need to know about this case. Something that changes everything." He held up the folder, his hands shaking so badly the papers inside rustled. "This is evidence," he said. "Evidence that proves my brother Mark has been hiding something big." The room erupted again, but this time the judge didn't bother to silence them. She was too busy staring at David, her expression a mix of shock and curiosity. Mark, meanwhile, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "David, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no right." But the judge cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice icy, "you will remain silent. Your brother has the floor." David took a deep breath and opened the folder. Inside were stacks of papers, bank statements, emails, and what looked like legal documents. He pulled out a single sheet and held it up for the judge to see. "This," he said, his voice steady now, "is proof that my brother has been hiding assets. He's been lying about his finances, Your Honor. He's been trying to manipulate this case from the beginning." The room went dead silent. Even Ethan, who didn't fully understand what was happening, could feel the weight of the accusation. Mark's face turned bright red, and he opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Claire, on the other hand, looked like she'd just been handed a winning lottery ticket. Her lawyer was already on her feet, demanding that the judge take the evidence into consideration. The judge, however, held up a hand, silencing everyone once more. She took the paper from David and studied it carefully, her expression growing, darker with each passing second. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, her voice cold, "is this true?" Mark didn't answer. He just stood there, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the floor. The judge didn't need him to respond. His silence was answer enough. She turned to David, her expression unreadable. "Why are you bringing this forward now?" she asked. "Why not earlier?" David hesitated, his eyes flicking to Ethan for just a moment. "Because I didn't know," he said quietly. "Not until today. I found these documents by accident, and when I realized what they meant, I knew I had to come forward. This isn't just about money, Your Honor. This is about Ethan. My brother has been lying to everyone, including his own son, and I couldn't let that stand." The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. She looked at Ethan, who was still sitting next to his grandmother, his face pale and his eyes wide with confusion. "Ethan," she said gently, "do you understand what's happening?" Ethan shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. The judge nodded, her expression softening for just a moment. "That's okay," she said. "You don't need to, but I want you to know that whatever happens next, this isn't your fault. You've been very brave today, and I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, but he didn't feel brave. He felt scared. Scared of what his uncle's revelation meant. Scared of what his parents would do next. Scared of what his life was about to become. He looked at his father, who was still standing stiffly, his face a mask of anger and shame. He looked at his mother, who was whispering furiously to her lawyer, her eyes gleaming with something that looked a lot like triumph. And he looked at his grandmother, who was still holding his hand, her face calm but sad. "It's going to be okay," she whispered again. But this time Ethan didn't believe her. The judge turned back to David, her expression serious. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "this is a serious accusation. If what you're saying is true, it could have significant consequences for this case and for your brother. But before I make any decisions, I need to hear the full story. I'm going to call a recess so that I can review this evidence. When we return, I expect everyone to be prepared to answer my questions honestly and completely." She stood up, her robe swirling around her, and left the courtroom once more. The room erupted into chaos again, but Ethan barely noticed. He was too busy trying to process everything that had just happened. His father had been lying. About money? About the case? And what did that mean for him? Would the judge still let him live with his grandma? Or would this change everything? As the lawyers huddled together, whispering furiously, and his parents argued in hushed, angry tones, Ethan felt more alone than ever. He looked at his grandmother, who was still holding his hand, and whispered, "What's going to happen now?" Margaret sighed, her eyes filled with sadness. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." The bailiff called for order, and the room began to quiet down, but the tension was still thick in the air. Ethan's uncle sat down in the back of the room, his face pale but determined. His parents were still arguing, their voices low but sharp, and Ethan sat there, his heart racing, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. What would happen when the judge returned? What secrets were still waiting to be uncovered, and how would this all end? The answers to those questions were still out of reach, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension in the room was unbearable. What would happen next? No one knew, but one thing was clear. This was a story that would change everything.